The telegram arrived on a Tuesday. Eleanor Ashford did not read it at the door the way people in stories always do, standing there in the cold morning light, hand pressed to mouth, knees giving out beneath them. She took it from the delivery boy, thanked him by name, closed the front door, carried it to the kitchen, set it on the table beside her half-eaten piece of toast, and stared at it for 3 full minutes before she opened it. She was 26 years old. She had been married for 14 months. Her husband, Charles Edmund Ashford, the 8th Duke of Ashford, had been at the Western Front for 9 of those months, and now the British Army, in its formal and measured language, was informing her that he was missing in action, presumed dead, following the engagement near the Somme, on the 14th of July 1916. Presumed dead. She read those 2 words 4 times, not because she did not understand them. She understood them perfectly. She read them again because there was a small, unreasonable part of her mind that caught the word presumed and could not let it go. The word was not confirmed. The word was not certain. Presumed was what you wrote when you did not yet know. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the grounds of Ashford Hall stretched away in the pale autumn morning, the grass still carrying the last of the night's frost. She could see the south garden from where she sat, the rose bush she had planted in May, the stone path her husband had helped lay on the one long weekend he had been home between his commission and his departure. He had complained the entire afternoon about the weight of the stones. She had told him to stop complaining and lift. They had laughed about it. That had been 4 months ago, and in the way that only the happiest small moments do, it had lodged itself permanently in her memory like a splinter she was not interested in removing. She folded the telegram into quarters, then into eighths. She slid it into the pocket of her apron and went to finish her toast. She did not tell the staff until the afternoon. She called them into the front hall, all of them together. Mrs. Burrows, the housekeeper, old Gerald, who managed the grounds, the 2 housemaids whose names were Alice and Dot, the kitchen girl called Rose, who had been at the hall for only 3 months, and was still learning which pantry shelf held what. Eleanor stood at the foot of the stairs and told them plainly and without ceremony. The Duke was missing. The army presumed him dead. There would be no formal mourning period announced until the matter was resolved in an official and final way. They were to continue their duties without interruption. If anyone wished to speak with her privately, she was available after supper. Mrs. Burrows, who had worked at Ashford Hall for 30 years, and had known Charles since he was a boy of 7, learning to ride the grey horse in the east paddock, pressed her lips together so hard they went white at the edges. She nodded once. The housemaids looked at each other and then at the floor. Gerald stood with his cap in his hands and stared at the tile. Rose, who was 17 and still learning the particular emotional weather of the hall, began to cry quietly into the corner of her apron. Eleanor thanked them for their attention and went to her study. She was 7 months pregnant. The weight of it had been making her back ache steadily for weeks. She lowered herself into the chair behind her husband's desk, which she used because it was larger and had more drawer space, and she had never been the type of person to leave useful things unused out of sentiment. She opened the household ledger and began checking the autumn accounts. She worked for 2 hours without pause. She found an error in the coal delivery records and corrected it with a note in the margin. She drafted a letter to the estate solicitors regarding the quarterly review. She was halfway through a note to the tenant at the North Farm about a fence repair when her hand stopped moving. Not because she chose to stop. Her hand simply stopped. She sat there for a long time, the pen resting against the paper, the study growing cold around her because she had forgotten to ask Gerald to bring wood for the fireplace. She did not get up to do it herself. Charles had a particular way of standing in doorways, not leaning against them, not filling them with noise, just standing there, one shoulder slightly forward, observing whatever room he was about to enter, as though he wanted to understand it fully, before committing to joining it. She had found it maddening in the first weeks of their marriage. That considered slowness, that reluctance to simply come in and be somewhere. Later she had found it restful. Later still, she had stopped noticing it altogether, the way you stop noticing the particular tick of a clock you have lived beside long enough. Now, in the cold study, the absence of it was very loud. She picked the pen up. She finished the note about the fence. That night, in the large bed that had been too large since Charles left 9 months ago, and was somehow larger now, she allowed herself 1 hour of being afraid. She was methodical about it, because she was methodical about everything. She lay still and she let herself feel it fully. The fear that he was gone beyond recovery. The fear that the word presumed would eventually become confirmed. The fear that she was going to be alone in this house with this unborn child, and the whole of her remaining life arranged in front of her like a corridor she had not chosen and could not leave. She gave herself the hour. When the clock on the mantelpiece struck midnight, she stopped. She took a long breath, and she made a decision in the dark that she did not speak aloud to anyone. Not then and not ever. She was not going to accept the formal death record, not until there was something more than a word like presumed to anchor it. The Army's formal letter arrived 11 days after the telegram. It was longer, more elaborate, dense with phrases like deepest condolences and extraordinary sacrifice, and nation's gratitude. It mentioned that due to the conditions of the Somme engagement, the identification of the fallen had proven difficult in many cases, and that the Duke's body had not been recovered. It expressed confidence nonetheless that he had fallen honorably in the service of his country. Eleanor wrote back the same day. She was polite, precise, and immovable. She acknowledged their letter. She thanked them for their service to the nation. She requested clarification on the formal legal meaning of presumed as used in military casualty records, and she asked whether documented cases existed in which a soldier listed as presumed dead had subsequently been found to be alive. The Army replied 3 weeks later with language that was clearly designed to close the matter entirely. It used words like regrettable and conclusive, and we must encourage you, madam, to begin the necessary arrangements at your earliest convenience. She filed the letter. She did not begin any arrangements. She wrote again. On the 22nd of November 1916, her son was born. He came early and fast, in the gray hour before dawn, with Mrs. Burroughs at her side and the village doctor who arrived barely in time to be useful, and who would later describe the child as the most opinionated newborn he had attended in 30 years of practice. The baby was small and extraordinarily loud, and had a quantity of dark hair that the doctor called unusual, and Mrs. Burroughs called a very good sign, though she declined to specify of what. Eleanor held him for a long time without speaking. He had stopped crying and was staring up at her with the wide, unfocused intensity that all very new people bring to the world, as though existence itself is a great deal to absorb, and they are already working hard at it. She named him Edmund Charles. Her husband's names, in her husband's order. Mrs. Burroughs, when she heard, went very still for a moment that lasted just long enough to be significant. Then she said, softly, that it was a beautiful name. Eleanor thanked her. They did not discuss what the name meant, or the fact that it was not the name that had been agreed upon in the long letters passing between the hall and the front, which had been George, after Eleanor's grandfather. She did not name him George. She submitted the petition to the Crown through the estate's solicitors, a formally worded legal request that no death record be issued in the Duke's name until such time as a body was recovered and positively identified. The solicitor had drafted it carefully. It was precise and gave very little room to maneuver around. The petition was denied within the week. She filed it again. Cadence. The winter that year arrived hard, and stayed longer than anyone wanted. The coal supply ran short in February. The North Farm tenant could not meet his rent. 3 roof tiles in the east wing cracked in the January frost and let in water that ruined 2 rooms and a section of good oak flooring. Eleanor dealt with all of it. She dealt with it while carrying Edmund in a sling across her chest because he was quieter and more content that way, and she did not have the time or patience to negotiate his unhappiness when there were accounts to manage and repair costs to calculate. Rose, the kitchen girl, had stopped crying by December, and had turned out to be remarkably steady with the baby in the afternoons when Eleanor needed both hands free for the ledgers. Edmund, at 3 months, had learned to smile, and he did it most reliably at Rose, who took this as both a compliment and a professional achievement. Eleanor filed the petition a 3rd time. She adjusted the wording. She sent it to a different department than she had the previous 2 times. Outside the hall, the war continued. The lists of the fallen grew longer every week. The post came every morning, and Eleanor sorted through it at the hall table, standing up, coat still on, and every morning there was nothing in it that changed anything. But every morning she looked, and every morning she filed what was there, and she did not stop. Edmund grew the way babies do, fast and then faster, and by spring he was pulling himself upright against the furniture and studying the household with the calm and interested attention of someone who intended to understand every part of the operation he had been born into. Eleanor watched him grip the edge of the desk and hold himself steady, and felt something move through her that she could not name cleanly, something that was not grief and was not hope and was not quite joy either, but was some particular combination of all 3 that she suspected had no word in English and simply had to be lived with. She submitted the petition a 4th time. She hired Peter, a 15-year-old from the village, to assist the groundskeeper, because Gerald's back was not what it had been, and the south garden needed more attention than one man could give it. Peter was afraid of Eleanor, in the respectful way that young men are afraid of competent women who do not make accommodations for incompetence, and he did excellent work. The hall waited. Eleanor worked. Edmund grew. And the casualty lists kept coming, and she kept reading every name, every week, because that was what you did when the word on the telegram was presumed rather than confirmed, and you were the kind of person who needed evidence before she would be moved. By the time Edmund was 2 years old and running across the hall floor on legs that had not yet fully committed to the idea of balance, the wooden box under Charles's desk was full. Eleanor had started keeping the casualty reports in it from the first winter, requesting them weekly from the Red Cross volunteer office in town, working through them each night after Edmund was in bed. She had filled the box by the spring of 1919. She started a second one. She had developed a system. First she scanned for the regiment, because Charles had been with the Royal Fusiliers. Then she checked the officer grades. Then she read the surrounding names on the page, the men listed near where Charles's name would appear alphabetically, in case any of them were officers he had mentioned in his letters, men whose survival or death might tell her something about what had happened in the area where he had last been seen. She cross-referenced these names against the letters she had kept, which she had organized chronologically in a leather file case she kept in the bottom drawer. She found nothing useful. Week after week, month after month, she found nothing that advanced the evidence one way or the other. She told herself, accurately, that this was not the same as finding nothing at all. It was confirming each week that his name had not appeared on a confirmed list. It was a kind of negative data, and negative data was still data. She told herself this. She believed it. She told it to no one. Edmund, at 4, asked questions with the efficiency of a small person who has discovered that adults will usually answer if approached at the right moment with the right tone. He wanted to know why bread went hard when it was left out. He wanted to know why the sky was different colors at different times of day. He wanted to know why Peter the groundskeeper's assistant always appeared to be concentrating very hard whenever Eleanor came out to the garden. He asked, one unremarkable Tuesday evening at supper in the morning room where they ate together when it was just the two of them, which was most of the time, why he did not have a father. Eleanor put her fork down. She looked across the small table at her son, who was watching her with an expression she recognized in the architecture of it as her own, the particular quality of waiting for an answer without having already decided what it should be. She told him the truth in the simplest form it would fit into. His father had been a soldier. He had gone to a great war across the water. He had been lost in the fighting, and they did not know yet, with any certainty, what had become of him. Edmund considered this for a moment with the same focused attention he gave to most new information. Then he asked whether lost meant dead. Eleanor said she did not know. He sat with this for another moment. Then he asked if there was going to be apple cake for afters. There was apple cake. Eleanor sat across from her son and watched him work through it with the seriousness he brought to foods he genuinely liked, and she thought that Charles would have been astonished by this child. He would have loved him immediately, and without knowing quite what to do with that love, which was how Charles had always managed the things that mattered most to him. He had loved the hall that way, and the north pasture in early morning, and her, which she had understood only slowly, because he was not a man who said things at full volume, when a quieter form of saying them would do. She was thinking about this clearly and with the full weight of her attention, and then she realized that she was thinking about her husband using the past tense, and she put the tense away deliberately, the way you close a book you are not yet ready to finish. It was the summer of 1923 that the letter came. It did not come from the army, it did not come from the Red Cross, or the solicitors, or any of the offices she had written to over the years. It came from a civilian hospital outside the city of Reims in France, a place Eleanor had never encountered in any of her correspondence, and it was written in careful English by a woman who introduced herself as the hospital's administrative head and gave her name as Sister Marguerite. The letter had been addressed not to Eleanor personally but to the estate itself, the address on the front reading Ashford Hall with the county below it, as though whoever had provided the address had given it from memory and supplied the broad shape of it rather than the precise detail. It had been redirected through 3 separate postal offices, which explained the gap between the date of the postmark and the date of its arrival, a difference of nearly 5 weeks. Eleanor opened it at the hall table the way she always sorted the post, standing, coat still on, Edmund at her elbow asking what everything was and whether any of it was interesting. She read the first paragraph and did not move. She read it again. Sister Marguerite wrote that the hospital had in its care a British man who had come to them by a route she would explain in more detail if contacted. The man had been without memory of his identity for several years following an injury sustained during the war. He had, some 2 years previously, recovered his name. His name, he said, was Charles Ashford. Sister Marguerite wrote that the man had asked her to write to Ashford Hall. He had provided the address from memory. He had then, Sister Marguerite noted in language that was precise and clearly chosen with care, asked that the letter include the following instruction: which she was passing along at his direct request. He was alive. He was recovering. Please do not come. Eleanor stood at the hall table with the letter in her hands, and did not move for a length of time she could not have measured accurately. Edmund tugged at her coat and asked what the letter was about. She said it was from France. He asked if France was a very long way away. She said it was. He asked if they had apple cake in France. She said probably, yes. He accepted this and went to look for his wooden horse, which he had misplaced somewhere between the kitchen and the back parlor. She carried the letter to the morning room. She stood in front of the fireplace, which had no fire in it because it was July and the mornings were warm. She read the letter a third time, standing there, reading the phrase, "Please do not come," with the same careful attention she brought to every line of every document that came to her. Then she held a match to the corner of it. She watched it burn down to ash in the empty grate. The ash was very small. The handwriting was gone. She went to Charles's desk. She sat in his chair. She took out a clean sheet of paper and her pen, and she wrote a letter to Sister Marguerite at the hospital in Reims. She introduced herself. She confirmed she had received the communication and understood its contents. She said she wished to respect the man's stated preference and would not be traveling to France at this time. She then wrote, at the bottom of the page, a single question. She asked only whether he knew his name. She sealed the letter, gave it to Peter to post that afternoon, and said nothing about any of it to anyone in the household. That night, after the house was quiet and Edmund was deeply asleep in the way that only children who have spent the whole day running can sleep, she sat in the chair by her bedroom window in the dark. She allowed herself to take out the feeling she had been managing carefully for 7 years, the one she kept behind the standard of evidence where it could not interfere with the practical work of running a life, and she looked at it plainly for a short while. She did not cry. She had not cried since November of 1916, the night after Edmund was born, when Mrs. Burroughs had gone to her own room, and the baby was finally asleep in the cradle, and Eleanor had sat in the chair next to it, and let herself do it for exactly as long as it took to pass. That had been sufficient. She was not opposed to feeling things. She simply preferred to feel them on her own terms, in her own time, when it would not cost her something she could not afford to spend. She put the feeling away. She went to bed. She slept. Sister Marguerite's reply arrived 3 weeks later. Yes, she wrote. He knew his name. He had known it for 2 years. He knew the name of the estate and the county. He knew the year of his marriage, and the name of the village nearest to the hall. His memory of the years before the war was intact. The injury, she wrote, had affected him in other ways, and she listed these carefully without sensationalism. A weakness and stiffness in the left hand, resulting from damage sustained before he had reached the hospital. A heightened sensitivity to sudden loud sounds, and a habit of stillness that the sisters had initially misread as low spirits, but had come to understand was simply the manner in which he processed the world. He was, she said, in otherwise reasonable health for a man who had been through what he had been through. He was, she added with what read as genuine warmth beneath the professional language, a gentle and private person who caused no difficulty and spent time in the hospital garden when the weather permitted. Eleanor set the letter down on the desk and looked out the window for a moment. The south garden was visible from here. The rosebush was at its fullest, July being its best month, and it had put out more flowers than the previous 2 summers combined. She picked the letter up again and read it to the end. Sister Marguerite noted, at the close, that the man had not asked whether Eleanor had replied to the first letter. She thought Eleanor should know this. She believed it was relevant information. Eleanor folded the letter and kept it. Then she wrote back and asked whether she might correspond with him directly. Sister Marguerite replied a month later that she had passed the request along. The answer came 3 weeks after that, in handwriting that Eleanor had not seen in 7 years. She recognized it in the first stroke of the first letter of her name on the envelope. She stood at the hall table with the letter in her hands, coat still on, and Edmund was not there this time because he was at his lessons, and the hall was completely quiet, and she stood there for perhaps 30 seconds before she opened it. The letter was not long. It was not easy to read, and not because the handwriting had changed, though it had become more careful and deliberate than she remembered. It was difficult to read because of what was in it, which was not what she had expected, and she was not a woman who was often surprised. He wrote that he was glad she was well. He asked about the estate in terms that were general rather than specific, as though he was afraid of claiming too much knowledge of a place he was not certain he still had any claim to. He said he had thought about writing many times. He said he had not known what he would be returning to. He said he had not been certain there would be enough of him left to be worth returning. She read that line very carefully. She wrote back the same afternoon. She told him about the estate in the plain and practical language of someone reporting on an operation, the coal arrangements, the roof repair, the state of the north farm, and what had been done about the fence. She told him about Edmund for a full page, the dark hair and the opinions about boots and the wooden horse and the apple cake and the buttons on her coat that he had found fascinating as a baby, and still sometimes gripped with the absent-minded focus of someone working through a difficult thought. She wrote about Edmund for a full page without stopping. She did not write, "Why did you say do not come?" She did not write, "I burned the letter." She did not write, "I have read the casualty lists every week for 7 years." She wrote about the rose bush in the south garden. She noted that it had done very well this summer, better than any previous year, and if he had any views on the subject of pruning in autumn, she was open to hearing them. She sent it. He replied within the week. He had 3 specific and practical suggestions about the rose bush, each of them detailed enough to be genuinely useful, and reading them she could hear his voice so precisely that it arrived in her chest before her mind had fully processed what she was reading. She sat with that for a moment, just sat with it, and then she read the rest of the letter. They wrote back and forth for 4 months. The letters were careful at first and then became less so, the caution gradually giving way to the habit of honesty that had always been the best quality of their communication, even at the beginning when they were still learning each other. He asked about Edmund's name and why she had chosen it. She explained. There was a silence of 17 days after that letter, which she counted, and then a reply that was shorter than the others and said that he was glad, and thank you, and he was thinking he might come home soon if she would allow it. She wrote back in a single sentence, "The gate will be open." She said nothing to Edmund that evening, but the next morning she told Peter, before he had finished his first cup of tea, that the front gate latch had been sticking, and she wanted it seen to and corrected by the end of the week. Peter, who had worked at the hall for 6 years and had never noticed anything wrong with the latch in all that time, went and fixed it without asking any questions, which was one of the qualities that made him genuinely useful. Eleanor stood at the kitchen window and watched him go out to the gate with his tools. The morning light was coming sideways across the garden. The rose bush was bare now, it being late autumn, but it was very much still there, the canes thick and dark and ready, in the way that things are ready when they have learned to trust the pattern of the seasons. She felt something she did not have a single clean word for, something that lived in the space between the last night before a long journey ends and the first morning after it does. She had felt it once before, standing in a doorway waiting for Charles to walk through it when they were still new to each other, before she had learned that certain feelings did not need to be named to be real. She let it stay where it was. She had work to do, and there was still time before it arrived, and she had learned better than most people that waiting, done correctly, is not the opposite of living. It is simply a different way of it. The gate was locked on the morning he arrived. This was not a failure of preparation. It was simply the particular way that important mornings often announce themselves, by not behaving as expected. March at Ashford Hall began early, and the gate was locked each night by habit, and had been for 30 years, and Peter, who was usually first to the grounds, had gone that particular morning before 7 to the village to collect timber and iron fittings for the south wall repair. The groundskeeper himself was in the far field. Mrs. Burrows was in the kitchen with Rose going over the week's provisions. Eleanor was upstairs, where Edmund was in the middle of a serious disagreement with his nursemaid, a quiet woman called Agnes, about whether a coat was necessary given that the son appeared to be making an effort. Edmund's position was that the son's effort was sufficient and the coat was excessive. Agnes's position was that March was not July and the coat was going on. Edmund had the stronger argument. Agnes had the coat and the height advantage. The coat was winning. Charles Edmund Ashford, the 8th Duke of Ashford, arrived at the front gate of his own estate on foot, carrying a single canvas valise, in a dark coat that fit him the way borrowed things fit people, which is to say adequately, but without conviction. He had been traveling for 3 days, Reims to Calais by train, Calais to Dover by the morning boat, Dover to London on the rail, London to the branch junction, and then the last 6 miles on foot, because the early coach had not appeared and he had not wanted to wait any longer than he already had. He set the valise down on the road outside the gate. He looked at the iron bars, 12 feet tall, black, exactly as he remembered them, as though the gate at least had declined to participate in the passage of time. He did not rattle it or call out. He put his right hand on one of the bars, not gripping, not pulling, simply resting it there, the way you might place your hand on something to confirm it is real, and you are real, and both things are happening simultaneously. He stood there for 11 minutes. He was precise about time now in a way he had not been before the war. It was one of the things that had come back to him and then stayed with unusual firmness, as though his mind, having lost so much for so long, had decided to hold certain things tightly to compensate. He looked through the bars at the gravel path, at the ground stretching away beyond it, the garden shapes still bare in early spring, the hall itself visible through the trees. The frost had not fully lifted from the grass. A bird was making a persistent and unresolved argument with something in the hedgerow to his left. The morning smelled of cold earth and the particular clean sharpness of a March day that intends to be better than it looks. He had been here before, of course. He had been here hundreds of times. He had grown up here. He had brought Eleanor here. He had walked that gravel path in every season. But standing outside the gate looking in was different from any of those memories. And he understood, in the way that you understand things that have no good language yet, that you cannot truly see a place from inside it. You need the distance of the outside view, and the locked gate, and the 11 minutes of standing to see it for what it is. What it was home, still, despite everything, despite all of it. Peter's boy from the village, a broad 16-year-old named Will who had been hired to help with the south wall work, came around the side of the hall with a wheelbarrow and stopped completely at the sight of the man at the gate. He looked at the man. He looked at the locked gate. He looked back at the man. Charles said quietly, through the bars, "Would you mind very much fetching someone from the house?" Will asked, with the directness of someone who has not yet learned that some questions are delicate. "Who are you?" Charles considered this question. He had given it a great deal of consideration over the past 2 years, in a much less abstract sense than most people are ever required to. He had a clean answer now. It simply still required a small effort to say, the way a door requires more effort to open when it has been closed for a long time, and the hinges have stiffened. He said, "I am the Duke of Ashford." Will stared at him for a moment with his mouth slightly open. Then he turned and ran for the house at a speed that suggested he had decided to treat this as urgent, which was exactly the right decision. Inside the hall, Agnes had won the coat dispute by the method of putting the coat on Edmund while he was distracted by something outside the window, a technique that relied entirely on his attention being finite, which it was. Eleanor had come downstairs intending to speak with Mrs. Burrows about the Thursday arrangements, and had reached the bottom of the stairs when Will came through the kitchen door, breathing hard, and with the look of a person who has important information, but is not sure of the correct way to deliver it. He stopped. He said, "Your Grace, there is a man at the gate." Eleanor's hand was on the newel post at the bottom of the stairs. She did not remove it. She said, "What does he look like?" Will said, "He is tall but thin. He has a dark coat that is a bit large on him. He has a bag with him." He spoke very quietly. He said he was the Duke. The hall was very still. Outside a window somewhere, the bird in the hedgerow was still making its argument. Eleanor said, "Where is Edmund?" Edmund was on the landing at the top of the stairs. He had come to investigate the running and the urgency, because he was 7 years old, and urgency was the most interesting category of event. He was wearing his coat, which he had forgotten to be annoyed about, and one of his boots was laced, and one was not, because he had come out of his room mid-lacing. Eleanor looked up at him. She said, in the tone she used when something mattered, "Go to the kitchen drawer, the one beside the window on the right side, and get the iron gate key, the long one with the square head." Edmund said, "Which drawer exactly?" She said, "The one beside the window on the right side, Edmund, which is what I just said." He turned and went. She heard him cross the kitchen floor, the sound of the drawer being opened, the particular rattle of objects being moved efficiently aside in a search. He came back to the top of the stairs holding the key out in front of him with both hands, like an object of ceremony, which in its way it was. She said, "Take it to the man at the front gate, please." Edmund looked at her for a moment. He said, "Who is the man?" Eleanor looked at her son across the staircase landing, this child she had raised in a house she had held together by sheer will and accurate bookkeeping, this boy with the dark hair and the serious eyes and the mismatched boots, who had asked her 7 years ago whether lost meant dead, and had accepted her answer of "I don't know," with a calmness that had undone her in private, afterward, in a way that nothing else had. She said, "Go and find out." He held her gaze for one more second, measuring whether this was a satisfactory answer. He was 7, and he was already very good at recognizing when adults were telling him the truth in the smallest shape it currently fit, which is different from being evasive, and which he had learned from living with her. He accepted it. He turned and went down the corridor toward the side door, key in hand. Eleanor stayed at the bottom of the stairs. She put both hands on the newel post. She breathed very slowly in through her nose and out the same way. She listened to the sound of Edmund's feet on the gravel outside, uneven because one boot was laced and one was not, growing smaller. Then she straightened her back and went to the morning room window where she could see the gate from a distance, and she stood there. Edmund reached the gate at a pace that was faster than his ordinary walk but not quite running, the way he moved when something was important, and he did not want to appear as though he thought it was, which was a habit he had definitely not learned from his mother. He could see the man through the bars when he was still 20 feet away, and he slowed down deliberately as he got closer, the way he always did when approaching something new that deserved a proper look before a decision was made. He stopped 2 feet from the gate. He looked at the man on the other side of the bars. The man looked at him. The man was tall, but not as tall as Edmund had imagined from Will's description, or perhaps the coat was making him appear smaller than he was. He had dark hair that was beginning to go gray at the sides and temples. He had a face that Edmund privately categorized as a thinking face, the kind of face that looked as though it had recently arrived at the end of something difficult and was still quietly working out what came next. He had one hand resting on one of the iron bars, not gripping, just resting. They looked at each other through the bars for a moment that was not uncomfortable and was very full. Edmund held up the key. He said, "I have the key." The man said, "I can see that. Thank you for bringing it." His voice was low and even. It had a quality of steadiness in it that Edmund recognized, the kind of voice that does not get louder when worried, because the person has learned that louder does not help. His mother's voice had that quality. He had always assumed it was something that happened to you when you managed a great many things for a long time. Edmund put the key in the lock at the angle he had learned from Peter and turned it. The gate swung open. He stepped back. He looked up at the man. He said, "Are you my father then?" The man had been half a step through the gate when the question arrived. He stopped. He looked down at the child in front of him, this small, determined person with the serious eyes, and the dark hair, and one boot laced and one not, and his mouth opened slightly. He had known there was a child. He had known it from Eleanor's letters, had read every detail she had given him about Edmund's hair and opinions and wooden horse, and apple cake with the specific attention of someone trying to build a real person out of words, because words were all he had had. He had known there was a child. He had not understood, until this moment, that knowing a thing and meeting it are entirely separate experiences. His mouth closed. He looked at his son. Edmund waited. He was good at this. He had been good at it his entire life, largely without knowing it, because his mother had built the house around the habit of patience, and it had grown into him the way everything in a house grows into the people who live there long enough. The man said, "Yes." Just the one word. Quiet, certain. Edmund stood with it for a moment. He understood, in the way that children sometimes understand things before they have the words to explain how, that some answers are not small just because they are short, that yes could be the whole of something. He accepted it. He turned and began walking back toward the house. After 2 steps he slowed without looking back, listening, and when he heard the sound of the gate swinging shut behind a second set of footsteps on the gravel, he adjusted his pace without comment so that they were walking side by side. He did not offer his hand. He did not speak. He simply walked, the key swinging from his right hand, and let the man walk beside him back up the path toward the hall. The gravel was loud under their feet in the morning quiet. The frost was almost gone now, the day warming at last, the weak spring sun finally making good on its earlier effort. To the left, the south garden was visible, still mostly bare, though something was happening at the base of the rose bush that suggested green was coming. Edmund glanced sideways at the man once, briefly. The man was looking at the house. His expression had gone very still, the kind of stillness that Edmund had seen on his mother's face sometimes in the evenings when she thought no one was observing her. The stillness of someone feeling something large and choosing not to perform it. Edmund looked forward again. He reached down with his free hand, the one not carrying the key, and without deciding to, he put his fingers into the man's left hand, which hung at his side. The hand did not close fully. There was something in it that prevented that, but it closed as much as it could, and it was enough. They walked the rest of the path to the door without speaking, which was the right way to walk it, and Edmund did not know that he would remember this walk for the rest of his life, not because anything dramatic happened during it, but because of the weight of the hand around his fingers, and the sound of 2 sets of feet on the gravel, and the quiet between them, which was not empty at all. Eleanor saw them from the morning room window. She saw Edmund's pace and the way his hand had gone into the man's, and she turned away from the window before they reached the door, because there are things you do not need to watch from a distance when you are about to be in the same room with them. She stood in the middle of the morning room and waited. She heard the side door. She heard Edmund's voice, the particular tone he used when he was narrating something to himself or to a new person, explaining the layout of a space as he moved through it. She heard the lower reply. The sound of it moved through her in the way that sounds do when they are attached to someone you have been listening for. The door opened. Edmund came in first. He crossed to the table and picked up his wooden horse with the calm authority of someone reclaiming their natural territory, and he did not look at either of the adults in the room, which was a form of extraordinary tact from a 7-year-old, though he was not aware that it was. Charles Ashford stood in the doorway. Eleanor had prepared herself for this in the only way she knew how to prepare for things, which was to stop trying to prepare and simply be ready. She had not imagined what he would look like, because she had made it a discipline not to imagine things that evidence could not yet support. She saw him now for the first time in 7 years and 9 months, and she saw all of it at once. The thinness, the gray at his temples, the coat that did not sit right on him, the left hand that was partly closed at his side, the way he was standing in the doorway. He was standing in the doorway the way he always had, one shoulder slightly forward, looking at the room before committing to entering it. She did not move toward him. She let him have the doorway for a moment, the threshold, the pause before entry. His eyes found her. He looked at her across the morning room the way you look at something you have been trying to remember precisely for a very long time and are now checking against the original. He said, "Eleanor." She said, "Charles." The room was very quiet. Edmund was guiding his wooden horse across the surface of the table with focused attention, making very small sounds to himself. Charles came the rest of the way into the room. He did not come to her directly. He moved first toward the fireplace, the way a person returning to a place moves through it slowly rather than rushing to the part of it they most need, as though the arriving requires a little time to be real. He looked at the mantelpiece, the clock, the arrangement of things she had changed and the things she had not. There was a photograph on the mantelpiece that had not been there when he left. He moved toward it and looked at it without picking it up. It was of Edmund, perhaps 2 years old, sitting in the south garden with his hands spread flat in the grass, looking at the camera with an expression of complete and unperturbed concentration. Charles looked at the photograph for a long time. Then he looked at Eleanor. She said, "There are a great many more." He said, "I would like to see them." She said, "You will have time for that." He was quiet. He was looking at her with the particular quality of attention she had once known so well that she had stopped recognizing it as particular at all, and now it was very distinct and very clear, the look of a man choosing between the safer version of the true thing and the true thing itself. She waited. He said, "I am sorry it took so long." She said, "You are here now." Edmund, from the table, said without looking up, "Papa." He said it the way you test a new word, not a question. Not an announcement, just the word, set carefully into the air of the room to see how it sat. It sat well. It sat as though it had always been in the room, and had only been waiting for someone to say it. Charles looked at his son. He looked at Eleanor. His face did something she recognized but would not describe, because it belonged to him and it was not hers to name. She said, "Mrs. Burrows will bring tea." He said, "Yes." He said it like a man who has remembered what yes means when it is said in a house where someone is waiting for you. Mrs. Burrows appeared in the doorway of the morning room 11 minutes after Charles arrived in it, which was the precise amount of time required to boil water, arrange a tray, and compose yourself sufficiently to carry it without your hands shaking. She had been with the Hall for 30 years. She had known Charles Ashford since he was a boy who tracked mud through the kitchen and apologized for it afterwards, which she had always considered a mark of good character, the apologizing rather than the mud. She set the tray on the table with the careful precision of someone performing a completely ordinary task that is not ordinary at all, and she looked at Charles with an expression that contained 30 years of loyalty, 7 years of quiet grief, and a quality of relief that was too large to be entirely dignified. She said, "Welcome home, Your Grace." He said, "Thank you, Mrs. Burrows." She nodded once, in the manner of someone concluding a conversation that did not require more words than that, and went out. Rose brought the apple cake 20 minutes later without being asked, using the best tin plate rather than the everyday one, which was the way that households mark occasions that do not yet have the right ceremonies. Edmund said, with the authority of someone who considers this a personal vindication, "It is a Tuesday." Charles looked at his son. He said, "Is the cake always this good on Tuesdays?" Edmund said, "Rose makes it on Tuesdays. It is always this good." He said this as though it were information of practical importance, which to him it was. He had not yet adjusted to the presence of his father in any visible way, which Eleanor was watching carefully and finding encouraging. Edmund was not a child who performed feelings. He was a child who absorbed them slowly and then acted on them days later, which was entirely her fault and she knew it. Charles sat in the armchair by the window, the one Eleanor had moved there herself 3 years ago for the angle of the afternoon light. He held his cup of tea with his right hand. His left rested on the arm of the chair in the partly closed way that she had noticed at the gate and said nothing about. He looked around the morning room with the deliberate attention of a man taking an inventory that matters. He looked at the desk. the ledgers on the shelf, the new curtains. The window and the view of the south garden through it, bare except for the rosebush, which was the furthest along of anything in the garden because it had been in longer and had better roots. He said, "You moved the chair." She said, "The light is better from that position." He said, "I can see that." He said it with a quality in his voice that was not about the chair or the light, which she understood, and she poured herself more tea. They spent the afternoon in the morning room, the three of them, in a way that was not forced and was not easy, and was simply the first afternoon of a thing that was going to take time. Edmund showed Charles his wooden horse with the brisk efficiency of a tour guide who has given this particular tour before and sees no need to embellish. He explained that the horse was named Biscuit because of its color, that Biscuit was faster than he looked, and that his stable, which was a wooden box lined with an old handkerchief, was under the table. He showed Charles the stable. He showed Charles the handkerchief, which had his name embroidered on it. Charles said, "Is that your handkerchief?" Edmund said, "It is Biscuit's." Charles said, "I see." He said it the way you say something when you are not really talking about the thing you are saying it about, and Edmund, who was 7 and already developing his mother's sensitivity to subtext, looked at him for a moment before going back to the horse. The solicitors arrived at 4 o'clock, having been sent a telegraph from the post office in the village, which Peter had carried on the instruction Eleanor had given him quietly at the kitchen door shortly after noon. The two of them, a young one called Mr. Holt and a senior one called Mr. Featherby, who had managed the Ashford estate's legal matters for 22 years, came in and sat across from Charles at the desk in the study, where Eleanor had been working for 7 years, and they went through the legal reality of the situation in a way that was careful and thorough, and took nearly 2 hours. Eleanor sat in the corner of the study with her own copy of the relevant documents and her pen, making notes in the margin when something required correction, which happened twice. The central fact, which Mr. Featherby laid out with the measured solemnity of a man who had spent his career dealing with complicated estates, was this. The Crown had issued a formal death record for Charles Ashford in 1917, following Eleanor's unsuccessful petitions. That record would need to be contested and overturned. There were legal procedures for this. Mr. Featherby was familiar with them, having dealt with a similar case after the war involving a soldier who had been held in a German hospital and not located until 1921. The process was not fast. It was, however, certain in its outcome, given that the man was sitting in front of him in possession of all his original identifying information. His military service records were available, and a French hospital had documentation of his presence in their care from 1916 forward. Charles listened to all of this without interrupting, which was how he had always listened to difficult information. He asked 3 questions at the end, all of them precise, and Mr. Featherby answered each one. Then Charles said, quietly, "I want to be clear on one point. My wife has been running this estate for 7 years. Whatever the legal adjustments require, nothing changes about her authority over the running of this property. She has earned that authority several times over, and I would like it to be documented as a matter of record." Mr. Featherby looked at Eleanor. Eleanor was writing something in a margin. She said, without looking up, "I have notes on the coal contract that will need to be reviewed." Mr. Featherby said, "Of course, Your Grace." She looked up then. She looked at Charles. He was watching her with an expression she remembered, the particular quality of attention he brought to things he found remarkable, and did not wish to make a fuss about. She said, "The coal contract is a genuine problem. The supplier has been overcharging for 18 months, and I have the receipts to demonstrate it." Charles said, "Then we should address that." She said, "Yes, we should." After the solicitors left, Edmund was brought down from the nursery where Agnes had been managing him, with varying success since the afternoon began. He had been told that the men with the papers were discussing house business and would be finished by supper, which he had accepted with the particular resignation of someone who has encountered house business before and knows it runs on its own schedule. He came in, assessed the room, and climbed onto the arm of Charles's chair with the easy confidence of a child who has assigned every surface in the house a purpose through sheer frequency of occupation. He balanced there, one leg dangling, and returned to the wooden horse, which he had brought with him. Charles sat very still for a moment, with the child balanced on the arm of his chair. He looked at Eleanor. She looked back at him. Neither of them said anything. There was nothing that needed saying in that particular moment, which was its own kind of statement. Edmund said, to the horse, in a low narrative voice that was not quite to himself, "And now Biscuit is in the south garden and it is spring." Charles said, "Does Biscuit prefer spring?" Edmund considered this seriously. He said, "Biscuit prefers autumn, actually, but spring is acceptable." Charles said, "I prefer spring myself." Edmund looked at him sideways. He said, "Why?" Charles said, "Because things come back in spring that you thought were gone." Edmund looked at the horse. He said, in the tone of someone filing information away for later, "That is true of Biscuit as well. I lost him behind the coal shed in November, and he came back in February." Charles looked at Eleanor. She was looking at the window. Her face was composed and still, and she was very clearly not looking at him. He said, "I am glad he came back." Edmund said, "I found him myself. Peter helped." He slid off the arm of the chair and went to show the horse the window view, which Biscuit apparently required on a regular basis. Charles watched him go. Then he looked at Eleanor again. She turned from the window. He said, "You did this." She said, "We all did what we needed to do." He said, "Eleanor." She said, "You would have done the same." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I am not certain that is true. I am not certain I would have held all of this together the way you did. I think it requires a particular kind of person." She said, "It requires a person who has no alternative." He said, "Most people have alternatives. They choose differently." She looked at him steadily. She said, "I was not going to stop until I had a reason to stop." He said, "And did you ever find a reason?" She said no. She said it plainly and without drama, and the plainness of it was the whole answer, and he understood it entirely. That evening, before supper, Charles asked Eleanor if he might go up and sit with Edmund at bedtime. She said yes, of course. She said it in the easy way of someone who has already thought about this and made space for it. He went upstairs and she heard, through the ceiling of the morning room, the sound of voices in low conversation. Edmund's rising and dipping with questions and commentary. Charles's steady beneath it. She sat at the desk. She opened the ledger to the coal contract section and went through the figures again, marking the discrepancies in red. She had been building the case for 18 months and it was nearly complete. She could present it to the new supplier in April, once the legal situation was settled and the contract renewal was due. She worked for 40 minutes. Then she heard Edmund's voice rise into the particular note it reached just before sleep defeated it entirely. The sleepy indignation of a child who wants to keep talking but cannot quite manage it. Then quiet. A few minutes later she heard Charles come down the stairs. He appeared in the doorway of the morning room and stood there in the way he had always stood in doorways, looking at the room before committing to it. She said, "He sleeps quickly when he is genuinely tired. You may have talked him to sleep." He said, "I may have talked him halfway. He talked himself the rest of the way." She said, "That also sounds right." He came into the room and sat in the chair near the desk, the one she used for visitors when there were visitors, which was not often. He looked at the ledger open in front of her. He looked at the red markings. He said, "The coal contract." She said, "Yes." He said, "Tell me about it." She turned the ledger to face him and began explaining the figures. She explained them the way she explained everything, clearly and without decoration, and he listened the way he listened to things that mattered, without interrupting, asking one precise question when she finished. She answered it. He nodded. He said, "You have been doing this since I left." She said, "Since before you left. You were not particularly interested in the accounts." He said, "I was not particularly good at them." She said, "No." He almost smiled. It was the first time she had seen anything close to it, and it arrived in his face the way it always had, slowly, from one corner. He said, "Has that been very inconvenient?" She said, "At times. Less than you would think. I found I preferred doing it myself." He said, "I imagine you found most things easier done yourself." She said, "Most things are." He said, "Including raising a child alone for 7 years." She looked at him. She said, "That one I did not find easier. That one I would have preferred help with." He was very still. He said, "I know. I am sorry." She said, "You were not in a position to help." He said, "I should have written sooner. I told myself I was waiting until I was better. Until I was enough. But waiting was its own kind of absence, and you and Edmund paid for it, and I know that." She looked at him across the desk for a moment. Then she turned the ledger back toward herself and picked up her pen. She said, "There is time now." She said it without making it larger than it was. It was a practical statement about a practical reality. There was time now. That was what was true. She preferred to work with what was true. He sat with her while she finished the coal section. He did not speak while she worked. He sat in the chair with his left hand resting on his knee and looked at the shelves of ledgers and files that represented 7 years of the hall's life, and did not say anything about them, because there was nothing to say about them that the shelves themselves did not already say clearly enough. When she closed the ledger, he said, "What do you need from me?" She looked at the question carefully before she answered it, because it was an important one and deserved a real answer. She said, I need you to learn the accounts, not to take them from me. To understand them well enough that we can discuss them, I need you to speak to the North Farm tenant yourself in April, because he responds better to a male voice, which I find irritating but practical. I need you to deal with the solicitors on the legal side, because that is your name and your title, and it is easier. And I need you to be the person who sits upstairs with Edmund at bedtime, because that is something I have been doing alone, and it is the one thing I have found genuinely hard to do well by myself. He was quiet for a moment, then he said, I can do those things. She said, yes. I thought you probably could. She stood up from the desk, straightening the cover of the ledger, aligning it with the edge of the desk surface with the automatic precision of someone for whom these small orders are not trivial. She looked at the shelves, then at him. She said, supper will be ready. He stood. He said, Eleanor. She looked at him. He said, the gate. Your letter will be open. She said, yes. He said, I have been holding on to that for 4 months. She said, I know. He said, it was enough. She said, I meant it to be. They looked at each other across the study that had been hers for 7 years and was now, carefully and without drama, beginning to be theirs. The house was quiet around them. Upstairs, Edmund was asleep, one hand on the wooden horse on his pillow, the other flung out to the side in the abandoned way of a child who trusts completely that the world will still be there in the morning. The library at Ashford Hall had always been the room that held things honestly. Eleanor and Charles sat in the library that first evening, after supper, after Edmund was asleep, after the house had done the particular settling it did around 9 o'clock when all the day's movement was finished and it could breathe. She had built a fire not because it was cold enough to require one, but because a fire gave the room a center and a reason to stay. They sat in the 2 chairs that faced the fireplace. Between them was a small table with 2 glasses of brandy that Eleanor had poured without asking whether he wanted any. He had picked his up and held it without drinking immediately, the way he used to hold things he was in no hurry to finish. They did not speak for a long time, not because there was nothing to say, but because they were both people who understood that silence, used correctly, is not the absence of communication. It is a form of it. It is what you give each other when you need to be in the same room, without the pressure of words managing the space between you. The fire moved. The house was very quiet. He said, eventually, I need to tell you something. She said, all right. He said, when Sister Marguerite wrote to you, when I asked her to put in the letter that you should not come, I have been thinking about how to explain that since the letters began, and I do not have an explanation that is good enough. I only have the true one, and the true one is not flattering. She said, tell me the true one. He set his glass down on the table carefully. He looked at the fire. He said, for the first 2 years I had no name. I had no way of knowing what I was or what I had left behind, or whether there was anything to go back to. That part I have made some peace with, because there was genuinely nothing I could have done. But then the name came back. The name came back, and with it came everything attached to it. The hall, the title, the solicitors, the obligations, and you, and the idea of a child I had not known about. He paused. The fire shifted. He said, and I was afraid that when you saw what was left of me, it would not be what you were owed. I had been in that hospital for years. I was thin, and I was slow in ways I could not entirely account for, and my hand did not work properly, and there were days when loud sounds made me stop functioning entirely for a period of time. I was not the man who walked out of this house in 1915, and I did not know whether the man I had become was enough for you to have come all that way for. I thought it might be kinder to tell you not to come until I was certain there was enough of me to justify the journey. He stopped. He looked at his hands. Eleanor held her glass. She looked at the fire for a moment, then at him. She said, you were wrong about one thing. He said, only one? She said, the significant one. You thought you were protecting me from a disappointment, but what you were actually doing was making a decision on my behalf about what I could bear, and you did not have enough information to make that decision correctly. He said, I know that now. She said, you had no way of knowing what 7 years of this hall had made me. You were working from a memory of a person who no longer existed, not because something bad happened to her, but because she had had 7 years of coal accounts and roof repairs and casualty lists and a child, and those things change a person in ways that are not diminishments. I was not going to be disappointed in whatever you were. I had stopped requiring a particular version of you quite some time before your letter arrived. He looked at her. She said, I burned the letter, Charles, not because it hurt me, because I was not going to let a piece of paper make the decision for me. And then I wrote to the hospital and asked whether you knew your name, because that was the only information I needed to begin. He said, why that question? She said, because if you knew your name, you were still in there somewhere. And if you were still in there somewhere, everything else was a question of time and effort, and time and effort are things I have in good supply. He was quiet for a long time. Outside the library windows, the night had gone fully dark, the March darkness that was still the old winter kind, absolute and without ambiguity. Inside, the fire was the whole of the light. He said, you kept reading the casualty lists. She said, every week. He said, for how long? She said, from November of 1916 until I received Sister Marguerite's letter. He said, that is almost 7 years of casualty lists. She said, yes. He said, were they very long? She said, they became longer as the war went on, and shorter afterward. In 1918, they were the longest they were ever going to be. He said, and you read every name. She said, every name, in order. He looked at the fire. He said, I was not on any of them. She said, no, you were not. And every week that you were not on any of them was one more week of data suggesting the word presumed had not yet become confirmed. I was treating it as a scientific question, a question of evidence. You were either dead or you were not, and until the evidence confirmed one or the other, I was going to keep looking. He said, very quietly, I had no idea. She said, of course you did not. How would you have known? He said, I should have trusted you with more information sooner. I should have trusted that you could hold whatever the information was. I did not, and I am sorry for it. She said, you have said that already. He said, I wanted to say it more carefully this time. She looked at him. He was looking at her with the particular attention that had always been his truest way of being present, the kind that did not perform itself, that was simply there, fully, without reservation. She had not seen it in 9 years, and she was seeing it now, and it was exactly the same and entirely different simultaneously, which was the only honest way to describe it. She said, there is one thing I would like to know. He said, tell me. She said, the years when you had no name, when you did not know who you were or what you had, was there anything in those years that was bearable? I am not asking whether they were good years. I am asking whether there was anything in them that was not entirely without value. He thought about this for a long time, in the way he thought about things that deserved the full weight of consideration. He said, the garden. She said, the hospital garden? He said, yes. There was a brother at the hospital, an older man, who spent most of his time there. He did not try to help me remember anything. He did not ask questions. He simply let me dig things and move things and cut things back, and after a while I became quite good at it. I did not know who I was or where I had come from, but I knew, in those hours, how to make something grow, and it turned out that knowing one true thing, even a small one, was enough to get through a day. She said, what did you grow? He said, roses, mainly. It was a particular sort that I kept trying to improve. It took me 4 years to get the pruning right. She looked at him. He said, I did not know, at the time, why roses. After the name came back and I began to be able to connect things again, I understood that somewhere in the part of my mind that had gone quiet, rather than gone away, there was a rose bush, and that it was mine, in some sense I could not fully articulate, and that it mattered. She was very still for a moment. Then she picked up her glass and took a small drink. She said, it has done very well. He said, you told me in the letters. You told me it was particularly good this past summer. She said, the best it has ever been. He said, that is the long canes from the previous autumn. If you cut them back too short in autumn, you lose the strength of the following summer. You need to be willing to leave more than seems right. She said, I will remember that. He said, it is not entirely different from other things. She said, no, I suppose it is not. They sat with the fire for a while longer. Edmund turned over in his sleep somewhere above them, the creak of the bed audible in the quiet house, the small sound of a child rearranging himself in the deep water of sleep. Charles said, he asked me tonight if I knew where France was. She said, what did you tell him? He said, I told him it was across the water. He asked if the water was very cold. I said it was. He said he had read that fish did not mind the cold because they were cold inside as well, and he wanted to know if this was true. She said, what did you tell him? He said, I told him I was not certain, but I thought it was probably right. He then told me that Biscuit, who I gather is the horse, is also comfortable in the cold because he is made of wood, and wood does not get cold in the same way that people do. She said, Biscuit has a complicated inner life. He said, I gathered this. He explained quite a lot of it. She almost smiled. It was very small, but it was genuine. The particular kind that comes when something makes you happy, without asking permission first. He said, he is very like you. She said, everyone says that. He said, he is also like you in ways that no one would say unless they had known you both well enough to see them. The way he files information, the way he decides something is true and then simply moves on as though the question has been sufficiently answered. The way he did not ask me a second question after I confirmed who I was. He took the answer and went forward. That is entirely you. She said, it is possible it is also him. People develop their own ways. He said, of course. But the starting material matters. She said, in that case, he has your stillness in doorways. He said, I have a stillness in doorways? She said, you stand in every doorway before you enter any room. You look at it first. You have done it since I have known you. He said, I was not aware of that. She said, you have been doing it for as long as I knew you. I thought it was deliberate. Then I thought it was habit. Then I decided it did not matter which it was because the result was the same either way. He said, and Edmund does this? She said, he does it and does not know he does it. He slowed down before he reached the gate this morning. He looked at you through the bars before he came close enough to speak. He was reading the situation before he committed to it. Charles was quiet. He looked at the fire. He said, I think I was afraid he would not know what to do with me. She said, he knew exactly what to do with you. He gave you the key, he opened the gate, and he walked you home. That was all that was required, and he did all of it without being told. He said, he held my hand. She said, yes. He said, my left hand, the one that does not. She said, yes. He said, he did not comment on it. She said, he would not. He is not that kind of child. He said, what kind of child is he? She thought about this, with the genuine attention it deserved. She said, he is the kind of child who accepts what is true, and works with it. He is not incurious, he asks a very great many questions. But he does not ask questions about things that are already answered. Your hand works the way it works, and he took it, and that was the end of his interest in the condition of it. The fact of you was the interesting thing. The details were secondary. Charles held his left hand in his right for a moment, looking at it. Then he set both hands on the arms of the chair. He said, I would like to learn the accounts. She said, I know. He said, I mean it, not as a formality. I want to understand what you have been doing, all of it. She said, the coal contract alone will take 2 evenings to go through properly. He said, I have time. He said it without any weight of irony, just plainly. As a fact about the current state of things, which was that he had time, and it was not the scarce and provisional thing it had been. It was just time, the ordinary kind, available in the ordinary amounts, as it is for people who are living their lives in the places where their lives are supposed to be lived. She said, then we will begin Thursday. The solicitors will need the first 2 days to start on the legal corrections. He said, that is sensible. She said, yes. The fire had burned down considerably. Neither of them moved to add more wood. The room held its warmth well enough for the moment, the stone walls doing what they had always done, keeping the cold out and the heat in, by virtue of having been built right in the first place, and having stood long enough to know their business. Eleanor set her glass down. She said, it is late. He said, yes. She stood. He stood. They were both the particular kind of tired that comes from a day that has asked more of you than most days do, not in work but in adjustment, in the slow and continuous effort of absorbing a new reality. She said, your room is the one you have always had. I had Mrs. Burrows see to it this week. There are fresh things. He said, you knew I was coming this week. She said, I knew you were coming. I was not certain of the exact day. He said, the gate was locked. She said, it is locked every night. It is not locked for you. It was locked because it was morning and Peter had not yet arrived. These are different things. He looked at her. He almost smiled again. That same quiet and slowly arrived at thing. He said, yes, I see the difference. She picked up the brandy glasses and set them on the tray on the side table, which was where things went when they were finished with for the evening, and not yet ready to be dealt with. Then she turned toward the door. He said, Eleanor. She turned back. He said, I did not know, when I was in that hospital without my name, without any of it, I did not know what I had here. I knew the shape of it, somewhere underneath. The roses knew. But I did not know the particular weight of it. The coal contracts and the roof tiles and the boy with his wooden horse, and the way you run this place. I did not know what you had made of it while I was gone. And I am glad, before anything else, glad in a way I cannot say accurately, that you did not let anyone take it from you, that you kept it and held it and refused every arrangement they told you to begin. She stood in the doorway, one hand on the frame. She said, I had very good reasons. He said, I know you did. She said, one of them slept upstairs and was named after you. He said, I know. She said, the other one was that I was not prepared to accept presumed when I had not yet seen confirmed, and I was always going to need the evidence before I moved. He said, and now you have the evidence. She said, you are standing in my library at 10:30 in the evening, which is very good evidence, yes. He said, it is. She said, good night, Charles. He said, good night. She went up the stairs with the unhurried step of a person who has finished a very long and important day and knows the bed will hold her. He stayed in the library for a little while, looking at the fire burn low, looking at the shelves, looking at the room that he had left and that had gone on without him, and that would now, slowly and without any announcement to the world, include him again. In the morning, Edmund found his father standing at the south garden wall, looking at the rosebush. The morning was cold and clear, and the frost was back on the grass in the thin white way of March, which always looked permanent and never was. Edmund came out without a coat, which Agnes had not managed to prevent because he had come down the back stairs, and stood next to Charles at the wall. Charles looked at the rosebush for a long moment. Then he began, quietly, to explain why it needed to be cut back differently in autumn, if you wanted the strongest growth in June. Edmund listened with the focused attention he gave to all practical information. He asked 2 questions, both of them precise, and Charles answered them without simplifying anything. Then Edmund said, will you be here in June? Charles said, yes. Edmund said, then you can show me. He said it the way he said most things, plainly, as a straightforward plan about a straightforward future. Then he went back inside to find his coat before Agnes could come looking for him, because it was better to produce the coat voluntarily than to be caught without it. Charles stayed at the wall for a while after. He looked at the rosebush, bare now, the canes dark and still, holding everything they needed for the summer inside them, in a form that required patience to believe in. He was very still. He was looking at the garden the way he had looked at rooms for as long as Eleanor had known him, before committing to entering. But he was already in the garden. He had already entered. The stillness was not hesitation. It was just the way he thought, and always had been, and the boy upstairs was already learning it, and the woman in the house behind him had known it for years, and none of them needed it explained. The frost began to lift from the grass as the sun got properly up. The garden came back to itself, the way it always did. The hall stood behind him, solid in the morning, its windows catching the light. He was home,